This is probably the absolute worst time to be listening to anybody because it's right after lunch. And I've already heard from several of you that you had to really pull yourselves out of your rooms to come here. Anyway, we're going to have some testimony this afternoon by 5 of our missionaries who are on our panel today. They're going to talk about how the Lord brought each of them to the Institute and what their vision of the Institute is. These missionaries, Barbara, Joan, Elsa, Lucy, and Mary Lou, represent experiences of consecrated lay women over a continuum of time. Their experiences as missionaries span the life of our Institute from the very beginnings with Barbara through the years to the more recently professed. They're going to reflect the growing maturity of our Institute. And these panelists also will reflect the diversity and the unity that we share, which is part of the characteristic of our Institute. And they will affirm the movement of the Holy Spirit among us. And so I'm very pleased to present our first panelist, Barbara Ottinger, our founder. Barbara.
Don't get really upset. The words are only written on 2 of these pages, not on all of them. So I won't take up too much time. But I'd like to start by saying I'm very grateful to Emma and her committee for the opportunity to share with you this afternoon how God led me to the Institute. The reason I'm very grateful, I had to go back and relive a number of long ago experiences. And I do think that I enjoyed reliving them a lot more than I enjoyed living through them. God led me to the Institute and the Institute to the USA almost simultaneously. So I can't talk about just myself because there wasn't any Institute when it was just myself. So I do have to talk a little bit about how the Institute came into the United States. I'm going to start today with my life when I left Johns Hopkins in Baltimore and followed the doctor with whom I had been doing bacteriological research to the National Institutes of Health when he was invited there just about the time that the rumblings of World War II were surfacing in Europe. And he had said to me that if I would come and set up his lab for him and spend the summer doing that, then I could go back to Hopkins and I could take some more of the classes that I had been taking in the School of Medicine. Well, you know, you plan and things never work the way you plan. So, as most of you know, I never did go back to Baltimore. I stayed at the National Institutes of Health. And I did do one thing, and that was to try to go to Georgetown School of Medicine and continue my classwork there. And until I moved to New Mexico, I had in my possession a letter from the dean of the medical school at that time saying that no woman would ever cross their doorstep. So if you want any proof that times have changed, I think that will give you a general idea of the fact that things do change. When I was working at NIH, I became engaged to a young naval lieutenant who was also assigned to do research both at the Naval Hospital and in Pensacola, Florida. And we had planned to marry. Well, Pearl Harbor happened and the USA went to war. And one day an experiment in Pensacola went awry and my fiance was killed. So I sort of had to start all over again. And there was a young woman who was our secretary of our lab unit, and she had been very, very good to me. She was Catholic, and that was sort of unusual too. And one night she asked me if I would like to go to a Young Christian Workers meeting with her. Well, I really didn't want to go, but she had been so good to me, I didn't know how to say, no, I don't want to go. So I said, yes, I would go. That happened to be the night that Father Stephen went to the Young Christian Workers meeting for the first time. He had been assigned there to replace a friar from the monastery who was being sent back to the Holy Land. Father himself had just come back from studying in the Holy Land in Rome, and on his way back, he had stopped in Belgium to visit with Canon Cardine, who was the founder of the Young Christian Workers movement. Father did that because he was interested in the role of the layperson. So his first meeting and my first meeting coincided. After the meeting was over, he offered to drive me partway home to where I could get a taxi or a streetcar to go the rest of the way. And he said to me, "Will I see you next week?" And I said, "No, Father, I don't think so, because I don't like women's organizations." So every Monday, I fought with myself, and every Monday night, I went back to the YCW meetings. And eventually, Father Stephen became my spiritual director. It was a very interesting experience. I've never known anybody who could irk me as much as intrigue me as Father Stephen did. I had never met a friar until I met Father Stephen. And some of the things he did irked me very much. Some of the things that he did inspired me very much. And I had a difficult time sort of sorting them out. There were two occasions that I think I'd like to share with you. The second oldest son of Father Stephen's younger brother, if you can keep that straight, was killed up in Philadelphia as he was getting off the bus going to his after-school job. And I knew the family had not too much money, so I wrote a little note to Father Stephen before he went up for the funeral, and I enclosed a blank signed check. And I told him how much money I had in my account, and he could use whatever was needed for family expenses. Well, when he came back, he returned the check to me with a little note that said, "If you can ever be as generous with your person as you are with your purse, you will have made a great step forward." So I've always kept that little note. So, I didn't think it was that funny. I had my own apartment. Every time you laugh, you see, you take a second off. I had my own apartment, and I really enjoyed that apartment. Father would say to me that I was very selfish, and why didn't I share my apartment? And I always said, "No, thank you." So one night, I received a phone call from a young Canadian woman who I knew slightly, but not too well. And she said she had been talking with Father Stephen because she was looking for a place to live. And Father Stephen said to her, "Why don't you call Barbara? I think she just might be looking for a roommate." So you see why he sometimes irked me. Well, eventually, Mary came and had dinner one night, and then sometime later she moved in. And we lived together until my parents came to the Washington area. The apartment was tiny, and we only had one closet. And Mary was the social secretary to the first Pakistani ambassador to the United States. And she had lots of clothes. Well, we finally decided how we could take care of it. We put them on the shower rod. But every morning it was quite a ritual. The first person who got up took down the clothes and took a shower. The second one took a shower and put the clothes back up. And we became quite adept at doing that. Father kept asking me what I was going to do with my life. And he said I was getting older by the minute. Well, of course, I knew that, but I wasn't yet 30, so I didn't think it was crucial. And so I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to marry and have a large family. Well, he said, you better get at it. And he suggested, I had been dating, but I hadn't found anybody I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And he said, why didn't I go west? Well, we were still frozen in our jobs. I don't know why he thought west was better than east, because all the great men were in military uniform anyhow. But we were all frozen in our jobs, and I couldn't leave. So in the spring of '47, he said to me, I think what you really ought to do is make a novena to the Holy Spirit. We called him the Holy Ghost then. On the Feast of Pentecost, to make a day of recollection. So I said, yeah, I could do that. So I did. And as I was making this novena and planning to go to the DOR, I did tell the Lord that whatever I found out on that day, I would do my best to follow through with. But I had a reservation, and I was hoping that the Lord would overlook that. Anyway, I did that. When the day was over, at the Madams of the Sacred Heart on Rockville Pike, I came away not being too sure what the conferences were about, but I knew deep down that I was not going to marry, that I would dedicate my life to God, but I would live in the world. And, you know, it all seems kind of strange to me, because this was only 1947, and you didn't do things that way. But I was so relieved. And I think the relief overtook any disappointment that I might have had that my plans were not going to follow through. But I was so relieved, because I had been afraid all that week that the Lord might decide, but he had better sense, I guess, that the convent was where I belonged. And I was so relieved when I found out that wasn't it. I just could never imagine myself in a little black dress with something up here. And so I was really very pleased, but I didn't know what to do about it. Father didn't know quite what to do about it. But I did tell all my friends that now I knew what I was going to do with my life. And fortunately, they didn't ask me what, because I really didn't know. Just about that time, my parents moved to the Washington area, and they bought a house. And I gave up the apartment, gave it up to Mary, and I moved in with them. That was '47. And in '49, they died within 6 months of each other. And I ended up with a house, which came in good stead eventually, but I didn't know it then. There are 4 young Christian workers that I would like to talk about briefly, because each one of them had a great influence on me, each in her own way. One is Mary Hatfield. Mary was a very recent convert, and she was so zealous, and her faith was so deep and so much alive that you couldn't help but be inspired by Mary. Another was Connie Larkin, and Connie came to a series of lectures that the YCW was having on, having really for engaged couples and about to be engaged couples. We didn't have pre-Cana conferences back in the late 40s. And she came with her boyfriend. He was not a Catholic, and Connie was a really good Irishman. And she wasn't going to marry this young man unless he became a Catholic. When she saw the advertisement of our lectures in the morning paper, she thought, this will do things. So she came to the lectures with him, but didn't move him at all. He still was not any more inclined to Catholicism than he had been before. So he left. And eventually, Connie became a member of the Young Christian Workers. a very interesting thing happened at this series of lectures. One of them was given by a physician, and the Washington Post was interested in these lectures because lay people didn't do things like that. And so they came and sat through all the lectures. The one given by the physician, they headlined in the next day's paper, "Catholic Girls Learn to be Cuddly Wives." And it didn't take very long for the Archbishop to call Father and to call me. And we went to see him. And I really think that we might have been excommunicated on the spot, except that the physician turned out to be the Archbishop's personal physician. And so we were safe. But it was good that we met with him. We also had a series of lectures on women, and again, the Washington Post covered all the series on women. We started back in the days before Christ and then after Christ, and what their roles were in the world and in the church, and it was very interesting. And again, the Archbishop called us up, and we went to see him. Well, the one good thing that came out of these meetings with the Archbishop was that when we learned about the Institute and so on, he was the one we had to go to see anyway, and we were really old friends. So it was very interesting. He was very, very good to us. The third member of the YCW was a young woman named Elizabeth. She was a student intern working in the reference library at Catholic University. And she called me at the lab one day and said, "I have something very interesting for you to see." So I stopped after work, and it was a Canon Law Journal, and in it was one of the first translations of Pravda Mater Ecclesia, translations into English, I should say, of Pravda Mater Ecclesia. And that was the first time we learned that, a lot of people had this idea long before we thought we did, and that things were being done about it. So I don't know what happened to Elizabeth. Our paths went like this afterwards, and we did not have too much association. The fourth person was a young woman named Anna. She knew exactly what God wanted her to do with her life, and we all kind of envied her because she was so certain. She was going to be a Poor Clare. So she went off to the monastery in Bordentown, and when she was a postulant, one of the tasks she was given was to straighten up their rec room. And she read the magazines as she put them into nice, neat little piles. And one of the magazines was the Franciscan Herald, and in it she found a little advertisement about so big, which said, "If you want to consecrate your life to God and live in the world, write to Father Gemelli." And gave his address in Milan. And that was the first time that, we had ever heard of Father Gemelli. Father Stephen had, of course, but we hadn't. And so Anna went on to be one of the abbesses in one of the Poor Clare monasteries, and then after Vatican II, she left and married. So her path had a little detour also. Father wrote to Father Gemelli, and he sent back a copy of the Rule and Constitution in Italian. Well, we weren't very good at translating Italian at that time, and we thought you had to be over 35 before you could apply. Well, really, the word in there was younger than, but we had made it older than. And so we felt a little better when we got a really good translation. But Mary and Connie and I were the three who were really interested in this concept, and we decided that we ought to go to visit Father Gemelli. Well, you just didn't pick up the phone and call your travel agent and get a reservation and cross the ocean in those days. It was a little more difficult. By that time, it was getting to be almost the Holy Year, not quite, but almost 1950. And we thought, well, gee, we really should go to visit him, but we wanted Father Stephen to go too. And for some reason that I've never been able to fathom, friars could not go to Rome during the Holy Year unless they led a pilgrimage. So we said, well, we'll plan a pilgrimage, and we'll make Father Stephen our leader. We didn't know what you did to plan a pilgrimage, but I think the Holy Spirit did. And I can't go into all of that now because Father Paul wouldn't let me, I'm sure. But I will say this, that two of the people who went on the pilgrimage, one was a woman from Detroit by the name of Stella Warfield, and the other was a young Protestant lawyer from D.C. by the name of Kay Staley. How we got them around to being numbers 5 and 6 in the Institute is also a story all by itself, but it is a good story. Number 4 turned out to be Ruth. And Ruth got her application in before Stella did, and that's why she got to be number 4. She was off because Stella knew about it first, see. But Ruth was Stella's roommate in Detroit, her apartment mate. Well, Mary couldn't go on the pilgrimage with us because she had to stay home and take care of her mother. So when we got to Milan, Father Ginny, the one who got me to the first YCW meeting, she wanted to go on a pilgrimage, but this was not her way of life. She made that known very quickly. Connie and myself went out to a town just outside of Milan to visit with Father Gemelli. They took Father Stephen up to see him, first of all, and left the 3 of us downstairs, and eventually somebody came down and got us and took us up. And Father Gemelli was really very cordial when he greeted us, but he made it clear in English that he had no intention of speaking English. And so all conversation that went on was in Italian, and that left us out in, left field, really. Then he took us over to a big room where there were a lot of women seated, and we didn't know then that it was a meeting of group leaders, but we found out sometime later. I don't think we knew what a group leader was. And whatever they said there, we didn't know because it was all in Italian. But as the meeting was over and we were walking down the aisle, everybody who could, all the women, tried to kiss us on both cheeks. I will never forget that because that was quite an experience. I've never been kissed so much in my life. Anyway, one of the women, as we were walking down the aisle, went like this to my dress, and then she went like this to my ears, and then she said, "No, no." And I said under my breath sort of to Connie, "She's not going to tell me what to wear." And Connie muttered back to me, "She just did." So when we got to the door and were ready to go down the steps, there was a woman standing there, and she smiled very nicely and handed each of us a holy card, and I still have the holy card. We had no idea until we saw some photographs much later that was Armida Borelli, but the person in the photographs had the same lovely smile and the same bright eyes that the woman at the top of the steps did. And incidentally, when we first met Father Gemelli, he was seated in a wheelchair. And I have the impression even today that his hair was rather unruly. It looked a little bit like he might have combed it, but I don't know. But his eyes were very, very bright and very keen. And you also got the impression that he could look straight through and see whether your backbone was straight or a little bit curved. He did not miss a thing. We went, after all of that, they took us down to eat something, and we were glad to eat. Some of the missionaries went with us and sat with us while we were eating, and I was so impressed with these women. I was impressed with their manner, not their manners, but their manner, and with how their hospitality and how genuine they seemed. It was just beautiful to see this. And then we went on to Venice and to Rome, and in each place we met other missionaries. They arranged that, and in each city, I was equally impressed with the missionaries that we met. And one of the missionaries we met was Ursulina. And later, a year later, when our applications were finally accepted, she was the one who was put in charge of us. She helped us by correspondence, and she was really very good to us and for us. I think she tried her best to make us into American missionaries, not Italian missionaries. And we appreciated everything that she did. She answered every letter that we ever wrote to her. And when one time when I wrote and I was beefing about the problems at the workplace and all this great stuff, you know, and I think my letter was a little bit righteous because everybody else was sort of wrong. And she wrote back and said, "There will never be an Easter without a Good Friday." And I've always remembered that because I thought that was rather wise. During the year that followed, there were only the three of us, Mary and Connie and myself. And Father Stephen used to characterize us this way. He said that if he made a suggestion or a recommendation, Mary would say, "Yes, Father." Connie would say, "No, Father." And I would say, "Why, Father?" And he always said that about us. In the fall of that year, Stella and Ruth came to Washington and got positions at Georgetown. And they moved into the house with Connie and me, and we were four. And we called ourselves the Glow Girls. Can you figure out why? Gilman, Larkin, Ottinger, and Warfield. But then Ruth got a position in Pennsylvania and left us, and we became the Low Girls. And we gave that up right away. Yeah, that just didn't sound good. We gave that up right away. But we lived together in the house that I had received from my parents. During the year that we were waiting for our applications to be processed, we decided, and before Stella and Ruth came to Washington, we decided that we ought to make a retreat. So we went out to Grosse Pointe in Michigan to make the retreat. And one of the things that we had to do on that retreat that we thought was very interesting, we were following the Italian Constitution and rule, and they had a very strict age limit, and Stella was very much over that age limit. We had to take a vote as to whether or not we would accept her if she was accepted. Well, you know what happened? We did accept her. And but we had to cast that vote, and it was very impressive, I think. Another interesting thing that happened on that retreat, the sisters asked Father Stephen if he would offer the community mass on Sunday because they were having very special guests. You remember those special guests? And I always thought they probably belonged to the Fords or the Pontiacs or somebody like that because they were very, very special. And mother and father were coming with their daughter. She thought she had a religious vocation, and they were not at all pleased about that. So would Father please give a very good sermon, as we called them then? Well, Father did such a good job that eventually he won over mother and father, and the young lady, instead of becoming part of the community at Grosse Pointe, became a Poor Clare. And so we felt that he did a really, really good job. In 1953, we made our retreat for profession at the Borden, New Brunswick at the Senecal. And nobody had told us, very much about what happened physically anyway when you made a retreat. So we thought, well, we're going to deepen our Franciscan spirit, so we'll go out and buy brown dresses. And we went and bought brown dresses. And then we began getting letters and little packages. We got our crucifixes and so on from Milan. And the sisters were very much impressed because, you know, back in 1953, you didn't mail packages abroad very much, and you didn't get letters and phone calls and so on. So they couldn't quite decide who we were, but they were very much impressed. And one letter said, "We forgot to tell you, but we always wear white for profession." So here we were with all brown. And we decided, well, we could do something about it. So we put Stella on the train up to Macy's in New York City, where she bought 5 white mantillas and got back to New Brunswick in a little more than an hour. It was really a quick trip. So we were going to go over to Bordentown to make our profession at the monastery there. And that was the time, too, you know, when you had to fast from midnight. Well, I don't know how long the drive was from New Brunswick to Bordentown. Couldn't have been too long, but it was long enough for us. And we felt very much impressed when Father Stephen said, "Now, each one of you must have a cup of coffee before you leave, because I don't want anybody fainting on the road and having an accident." So we really felt very avant-garde because we could have a cup of coffee. Nobody did that. Everybody had to fast from midnight. But we did, and we had one pro band at that time. That's what they called them in the beginning. And that was Kay Staley. Kay played a very important part in our little ceremony of profession because she was the only one who smoked and had matches. And so she could light our candles. And they were very important. And I think at this point, I'd like to just say a word of gratitude to Father Stephen, because he really believed in the power of the layperson, including women, before it was either popular or acceptable to do so. At that time, you know, we used to laugh and say that the role of the laity in the church was to pray and to pay. And that was really what it was all about at that moment. But Father believed that far more could be done than that. And he took a lot of ribbing and a lot of jibing from his fellow friars because he did believe in the role of the lay person. I remember one guardian at Holy Name College who was not at all sympathetic to our cause. And when we would go over there in the evening for a meeting, promptly at 9 o'clock, he would throw the switch and all the lights went off. And there were 2 sets of stairs on the steps on the outside. And when we went to leave, it was pitch black dark. And at the bottom of the steps was a rose garden. And after we had ruined a couple pairs of nylons by getting into the rose garden by mistake, we got very wise and we brought our flashlights. And so we didn't really mind whether or not he had turned out the lights or not. Well, I'm supposed to tell you what my vision of the Institute is. And I think it's very simple, but I think it's very true. I see it as a way of life. I see it as a proving ground. I see it as a school of fraternal love, where we can hone all our spiritual skills and our values, and where we can find support for the role that we must play if we are to be present as a countercultural force in the world of today. And I thank you.
Now, do you really think I in any way, shape, or form would have dickered with her at that point? My mother might have got stuck with me, but she didn't raise an idiot. The other thing is I want to propose to you then is because I think there's something, if you really read the feeling of a room, is that there's something happening here. And one of the things I want to propose, but I need your permission in order to change any rule at any time that we've already established, is I would like to hear from the other 4 women this afternoon. And I think then you can spend your time at dinner being able to share some of your own story. Does that sound all right to you? Okay. Then let's decide that we're going to do that, okay? And we're going to continue to move forward with our sharing and hearing from our speakers.
Barbara, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You have helped us really get in touch with our history, and it's something very important for us. And while I've heard some of those stories before, I haven't heard all of them, and I'm sure it's the same for each and every one of us here today. So we really appreciate your sharing. It makes our vocation a lot more precious because we realize more and more what it took for the vocation to come to us. And we thank you very much for all that you have done for us. Next, we're going to hear from Joan Miller. Joan came a little after Barbara.
I always come a little.
But her story is also a story that is going to touch us, because her story, as with all of our presenters today, is our story.
Thank you. My first task is, sorry. I hate to speak under pressure, and unaccustomed as I am to be up here. First of all, let me give you some particulars. The planning committee had really suggested someone else. I want you to know that out front, so that you, okay, it was supposed to be Kay Lawrence, and as of course you know, Kay has her mother to take care of. Secondly, I want you to know, I came to the Institute before they did psychological testing. And I'm going to clearly demonstrate why we got psychological testing. I'm sorry. I get excited. Can I say? Okay. All right. First of all, I met the Franciscans. My mother had a summer place on Long Beach Island, Long Beach Island, Beach Haven. And I was quite impressed by the priests that we met. Each one seemed different. Everybody did their own thing. You know, I had come from a Jesuit college, okay? And so I thought, gee, these guys are really alive and great. I really do like this. I think I'll check into the, the Third Order of St. Francis. Well, of course, down at the beach and all this other kind of great stuff, I really enjoyed feeding the seagulls. So I used to chop up some fish and go down, and out of nowhere, I'd throw this up, and the gulls would come and all this other kind of great stuff. So when I came into the Institute, I came with these flock of birds, and they still follow me. I mean, there's a flock coming now and passing over. Don't get upset. Heathcliff, stay there. Heathcliff, don't you dare. No, Heathcliff. By gum, he did it again. But anyhow... I was, go sit over there on the Livingstones. But anyhow, what we did, that's why psychological testing came into the Institute. So now you understand, it's not a personal thing. I was the one that started it, so you understand. All right, to go back to my life history, which you really don't want to hear the whole thing of it anyway. But I worked at RCA, and my brother, a budding engineer, worked at RCA, and we both worked at the same location. And in my brother's unit, where they were molding all these lovely engineers into very productive people, was the key force to RCA, which was Emma Roper. And Emma was the executive secretary who lorded it over all of these engineers and got them to get their reports in on time and write in good handwriting and all this other kind of great stuff. Well, my brother was impressed with Emma. So he told her, you know, my sister's interested in the Third Order of St. Francis. So over comes to my office this very chic secretary, looking very, very good looking and all this great stuff, and said, I understand you're interested in the Third Order of St. Francis. I said, yeah, I always thought it would be nice. I said, it would really be a lovely way of life. Plus the fact I think they bury me in my brown habit. And she said, oh, okay. Well, she said, I have this Franciscan priest I'd like you to meet, and if you can ride with me up to Patterson, I'd like to introduce you to him. I said, oh, sure, fine. We ride up there, and she introduces me to Father Stephen. And she's out in the car probably saying the rosary or Naveen, I have no idea. I'm inside. Father's talking to me, and Father says, well, come follow me. And I said, sure, Father, I'll follow right in back. Then suddenly we come to a doorway, and he goes, Kim, don't come in here. This is the cloister. I said, Father, you said follow me. I'm going where? No, you go down that hallway and sit in the parlor. So I went down there. I thought, God, I hope he comes out. Nobody's coming out of anywhere. Well, he came out, and he began to talk to me, and he said, well, you know, there's a little more to the Franciscan life than just the Third Order of St. Francis. He says, there's a dedicated way of life. I said, a what? He said, a dedicated way of life. I said, oh, okay. I thought she was supposed to bring me here to hear about the Third Order of St. Francis, and now I'm getting a dedicated life. I thought, well, you know, keep your ears open and let's hear what he has to say. So he said, there's going to be a meeting down in Washington, D.C. of the CMSI, whatever. Okay, whatever. She remembers, I don't. Okay, we went down there, and all of these people are here explaining this way of life, and I'm saying, oh, this is sure heavy stuff. So I listened and I listened. Okay, so we're riding home on the train, and she's saying to me, you're not saying anything. I said, I'm thinking. She says, you're not saying anything. I said, I'm thinking. She said, could you please think a little louder? I said, I gotta give this some serious thought. I said, okay. I said, let me think about it. So I went home, and my mother said, how did the trip go? I said, it was very interesting, Mom. Very interesting. And my brother says, how did it go? Very interesting. Very interesting. So I couldn't tell them anything. So then I said to Emma, I'm going to try this life. I don't say I'm going to belong to it, but I'll try this life. Well, the first thing I did is I started to go to daily mass. Now, I did not come from a Protestant family, okay? Nothing against Protestant, but my mother was Josephine McGee Miller, okay? And so you got the McGee in there. My brother had gone to LaSalle, Villanova, Notre Dame, and I had gone to St. Joe's, so we did know the faith a little, okay? But anyhow, this bit of trotting off to Sunday mass, or to daily mass kind of threw my mother a little bit, and she goes to my brother, I think your sister lost it. And my brother's saying, I don't think she ever had it. But anyhow, so she's saying, I think we have a real problem here, you know. I said, Mom, you know, there's so few people praising the Lord, and he's been very good to us and all this other kind of great stuff. So she started to buy that, and I said to Emma, okay, you know, this sounds pretty good. I said, give it a whirl. I said, how long do I have before I have to bail out if I don't like it? She says, well, you got 3 years. We can trot this through, and I can be your guardian and guide and direct you the right way or the wrong way, whatever. So I said, okay, we'll give it a try. Well, anyhow, I entered the Institute by the grace of God. And so now I had to live poverty, chastity, and obedience, which took some odd turns with regard to my family. Okay, first of all, let's go with poverty. I suddenly had a black book, and I was writing all this stuff down. Went to the A&P, $10.30. Bought gas for the car, $5.60. My mother says, what's going on here? You got a little black book. I said, Mom, I think it'd be a good idea if I kept a record of all the things I'm spending. She says, if you're going to keep a book, I'm going to keep a book. You're going to find out what I spend on the house. I said, Mom, you don't have to keep a book. That's not a problem. No, I'm keeping a book. So finally, she worked a deal on me. She said, you know, I'm getting tired of writing in my book. I said, well, don't bother. She says, no. She said, now, when we go to the store, I'm not taking any money. You can spend your money and you can write it in the book. So for the rest of my life, she never had money in her wallet. And every time we went to the store, she said, I don't have any money. It's time for you to spend. Write it in your book. Okay, with regard to chastity, even at almost the end of her life, she was still concerned that I could not take care of myself. I don't know why. She had this grim feeling that, you know, once she was gone and the family was away, that I was, you know, going to go down the tube, and I really needed somebody to give me TLC. And I thought, well, the Lord's doing pretty good. No, you need somebody to take care of you. You go back with your brother. Take care of your brother. I said, Mom, I'm not going to take care of him. I've been taking care of him most of his life. He's got a wife and kids. I said, I'm not needed now. Well, let him take care of you. No, I don't want to be bothered with him. I said, he's doing fine. So anyhow, to calm her fears, I said to her, don't worry, Mom. Once you're gone, I said, I'm going to have 5 dogs, 3 cats, 2 bowls of fish, and 5 mynah birds. Well, when we got to the mynah birds, she was convinced that no one in their right mind would live with me and that I would do fine, which was great. So we got over that hurdle. But then came obedience. And she was interested in the fact that I always went to my room and closed the door. Now, when Mary O'Connor Roper and Josephine McGee Miller got together, they could not understand why their daughters went into their rooms and closed the door. Same obedience. And she was interested in the fact that I always went to my room and closed the door. Now, when Mary O'Connor Roper and Josephine McGee Miller got together, they could not understand why their daughters went into their rooms and closed the door. So Mary O'Connor would say to Josephine, "What do you think they're doing in there?" And Josephine would say, "I don't know, Mary, but I think we ought to find out." I said, "Oh, Lord." I said, Emma, I think we're in big trouble. We got to keep the doors open so our family can see what's going on. So as a result, I would keep my bedroom door open. My brother would come charging in. "I can't balance my checkbook. Here, look at this." Okay, I said, "Okay, I'll fix it." My mother's making something in the kitchen. "I want you to taste this." So in she would charge, and I'm in the middle of a psalm or an hallelujah or whatever. I have no idea. "Yeah, Mom, that tastes good." Okay, so Emma started to open her door so her mother could see what was going on. But the cute part of it was, we did this John Boy thing at night. "Good night, Bill. Good night, Ma." And as everybody would ring out their thing, and my mother, as she was coming to me, would say, "And did you get your reading done today?" I said, "It was a hard day, Mom. I didn't get it all in." And the voice would say, "Well, try harder tomorrow. God will forgive you." I thought, give me a break. But it turned around. She started to do all of these things. She started to go to daily mass up until the time she died. She went to daily communion. She had her reading, and God forbid I came in with a newspaper article and want to interrupt her. "Mom, have you be quiet. I'm doing my reading." I said, "Okay, Mom, tell me when you're through and I'll show you what I want to show you." And deep down, I think she was a Franciscan. She had great devotion to St. Maximilian Kolbe, though she always denied, and pushed off all this great stuff. But it was very, 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 very interesting in living with a Mother Superior. I mean, it really got tough sometimes. I thought, this is something, and my brother kept reassuring my mother, because she'd always asked, "Now, Mary O'Connor Roper has great faith in Father Stephen," and I don't know Father Stephen that well. "You know that Emma Roper, you think she's straight?" "Yeah, Ma." "No. Yeah, don't worry, Mom." She says, "I'm not quite sure what road she's leading Joan down, and you know how naive Joan is." My brother kept saying, no, to this day, my brother's the best supporter of Emma Roper, even though he doesn't know she's in the Institute. But anyhow, that gives you a little working idea of how I came into the Institute and the life that I led with my family and everything like that. It's in my opinion, a very rewarding life. It's made me grow. Unfortunately, I'm growing at other places, but it's made me grow. It's been very supportive. It's the purpose for my living, and I really do appreciate it. Heathcliff, get off of those living stones. Come over here. It's time to leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. We need humor in our life. There is a Juniper alive and living in SIM USA. Thank you very much. Elsa, you're next up. She has her little bottle. It's one of those dark bottles, the kind you usually see stuck down in a bag somewhere. But she'll have it together in a moment. Okay, thanks.
Hi. I did change tablets. They're not all written on, but there are more than 2. Can you hear me? I've been dying of a cold the last couple of days, but it didn't work fast enough for me to skip giving this. From time to time over the years, I had wondered if the Lord might not want me in a convent. Largely, I suppose, because I was having so much fun in the Marine Corps. And the saints all seem to prefer suffering, and I've never liked suffering. about 1962, the Lord spoke to me clearly from Thomas Merton's book about the year he took his final vows. And the sentence that hit me directly was something like, I finally realized that the Lord intended me to work out my salvation in the midst of all these ancient manuscripts I loved so well. And I didn't have anything to do with ancient manuscripts, but the entire military scene was something that I loved so well. And ever since then, I have been very comfortable with the fact that that was where the Lord intended me to work out my salvation. In '64, as a captain in the Marine Corps, I was ordered from Quantico, Virginia to Paris, France, and I decided to take a couple of weeks leave in the Holy Land since I was supposed to report shortly after Easter. And in the Holy Land, I was impressed to actually see the Franciscans in their custody of the majority of holy places. My younger sister, who by the way has never joined a Third Order anything as far as I know, had talked to me a little bit before about how nice Third Orders were, and that you could belong to the Lord a little more directly without being in a convent. And in asking her opinion, she said, well, she didn't really have a strong preference, but she thought the one advantage the Franciscans had was that they had a habit because there was a cord. And if you couldn't wear your cord on top, which the Marine Corps really would not permit, you could wear it underneath. And I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure that tying a string around my waist was something really important. But the custody of the churches in the Holy Land impressed me. Still of Spanish extraction, the Jesuits and the Dominicans have always had a certain amount of appeal. And with all deference to my friend whom I dearly love here, I've never been sure about talking to birds. And now that I think about it, that's not really true. I have always been sure about talking to birds. I'm not into it. I walked into the parish church of Holy Savior, and as I went down the aisle, I was comparing the Franciscans and the Jesuits in particular, but of course they didn't have a Third Order, so I was also comparing them with the Dominicans. And I was preferring the Spanish side, and I kind of said to the Lord, if these Franciscans were only a little more political, I would become a Third Order Franciscan. At which point I arrived at the cross point of the transept, and looking up I saw a full-length portrait painting of King Louis of France in royal robes, St. Louis, and looking across the church I saw the full-length portrait in full robes of Queen Elizabeth of Hungary. And I felt the Lord saying to me kind of teasingly, how much more political can you get than a king and a queen? Now, I had a real wrestling match with myself or the Lord, or however you want to put it, over joining the Third Order. I never did have any question about joining the Institute, except until I heard of it, I didn't. I think it was '68, stationed by then in Washington, D.C., that I made a novena to the Miraculous Medal on successive Mondays at the D.C. church. What's the church? Holy Rosary? Yeah. Sort of on 4th Street. Anyway, every Monday they had a perpetual novena to the Miraculous Medal. I don't really remember what it was about, but I do remember that it worked. So I thought I should do again a novena of Thanksgiving. And in November they announced that they would have all-night adoration on the Wednesday preceding Thanksgiving Day. Now, I love Thanksgiving. The great American secular holy day, and these days I don't know if the Supreme Court lets us say whom we are thanking, but we sort of knew anyway. My principal roommate was Mary Blooming, a fellow Marine officer, and she kindly dropped me off that night for all-night adoration, at the appointed time, and I had more luggage than you could shake a stick at, because I knew I'd have to stay awake. I knew I'd have to have things to do. I figured I'd get hungry. I had a thermos, maybe two. I had, snacks. I thought 10 to 12 hours of staying awake would be a real challenge. I wasn't smart enough to realize that an organized all-night adoration, at least a Catholic one, would be structured. And so we had, certain periods of quiet, but we also definitely had certain periods of structure, certain periods of snacks, certain periods of coffee, a half to a third at a time. It was kind of neat. Anyway, one of the things they had us do to stay awake was to get up and walk around the church, either singing or saying the rosary or whatever. And once upon a time, a missionary, I guess number 6, named Kay Staley, had obtained the pastor's permission to put in some pamphlets, some brochures in the church. And at that point, I had the feeling that I had probably read every brochure. This is before desktop publishing. Every pamphlet the Catholic Church in this country had. But there were a couple of new ones there as we walked by the pamphlet rack. So every time we went by, I picked up a brochure. And by the end of the evening, I don't remember, it was 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, but they were all on the Secular Institute of Missionaries of the Kingship of Christ. And during the quiet time and when we were seated, or when I wasn't particularly interested in what else was going on, I had read these. And it caught my attention. You could stay in your job. There was no habit, and especially, you did not have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. But I was really intrigued with the poverty, chastity, and obedience officially recognized by the church. You can't hit the podium because the microphone's here, okay? Sort of thunking on the mic. It seemed like the best of all possible worlds. And Father Stephen Hartigan's name was on there, and this is kind of funny because I knew him from the Third Order. The Lord had kind of sneakily gotten me into this Third Order when I was stationed in Paris, okay? I was isolated in Paris as an American, member of the New York province. I was isolated in North Carolina, but when I was transferred up to D.C., there was a fraternity which met in Bethesda, Maryland at a place called Villa Cortona. So I attended meetings there, and Father Stephen was starting up a fraternity in Northern Virginia, and he asked Mary B. and me, since we lived in Northern Virginia, to join that one. And I learned later that the villains really got all over him for suggesting that we leave the villa, and have our meeting in Virginia. And then later on, Father said he wanted to talk to me about a way of life and asked if I would meet with him. And I agreed, and we made an appointment in August. And I forgot about it. And I stood him up. And later I apologized, and he seemed kind of embarrassed, and we let it go. And it's probably a good thing, because we were rarely on the same wavelength. And he probably would not have started out by saying that I wouldn't have to get up at 5 or 6 in the morning. And he probably wouldn't have understood the calling of staying in uniform. But still, I think it made a big difference that I knew the contact name on the back of the pamphlet. And when Mary picked me up the next morning at 7 or whenever we were permitted out, I stepped into the car and waved the pamphlets and said to her, "Guess what we're going to do?" Well, we knew a lot about each other. Actually, it always made my mother mad because I was rooming with her mother, as well as her dog. The cutoff age was listed. I had an October birthday. We're talking about late November. I didn't have a problem on the age limit. But I was in kind of a hurry to move Mary because her birthday's in early January. And I kept asking her if she'd written her letter, and she kept saying no. And finally I pinned her down, and she said, "Look, this is supposed to be my decision. Now, let me think it over and decide." And I knew it was supposed to be her decision. I mean, I said, "Oh, sure, I'm sorry." So she wrote the letter. But I knew she was right in telling me to lay off. We had got our answer back from Rome, and it was a yes. And it was dated February 11th, Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes. And that was great. But I was on orders to California, and I was going to be leaving soon. So we were received at the next meeting, which was the 9th. And I've always enjoyed the fact that we got admitted before the date on the "You're welcome to the Institute" letter. reason I'm in the Institute is it's very clear to me it's where the Lord wants me. And the rest of it is sort of peripheral and not always terribly efficient. I still don't talk to birds. But I do talk to four-legged furry ones. I mean animals. It's the call. There's nothing else. If it's where you belong, it's where you should be. And if it's not, no point to it. The Lord helps with faithfulness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elsa. Now, before we hear from our last two panelists, it's time for a calisthenic break. Our next panelist, excuse me, is Lucy Sink. Lucy's going to bring a whole new perspective to this. I know. Lucy.
I talk to birds too. and some of them are furry and have 4 legs.
Some of them are furry and have 4 legs.
As I was listening to the 3 ladies ahead of me, I was thinking that it's culture shock time, guys. When I was about 12 years old, Vatican Council hit really hard, and this is a major influence in my life, along with Star Trek. That's where the 4-legged furry birds come from. I never went through a time in adolescence of questioning the existence of God and leaving the church. I considered doing that around 30 or 40 or something, or delayed reaction. But very much had a time of awakening, I think, mostly because of Vatican II. It's like the whole world was just opening up. And the philosophy of unity and diversity was going along with themes in shows like Star Trek that had morality plays. And when I went to a Catholic college, Dominicans, not Franciscans, but Dominicans, they're okay people. Okay. I had a very charismatic priest, and in fact, the charismatic movement was going on. Started learning about the Holy Spirit, rejoicing in going to Mass for the first time, being with like a whole culture of people who saw the Mass as something to go to because you love God, not because you're afraid you'll go to hell if you don't go to Mass. And it became a real celebration as we were all invited to get as involved as we could. We learned to bake the bread, and we all got involved with singing, whether we could sing or not, and learned to play instruments and go to prayer meetings. We met people from other faiths. It's very ecumenical. And the Holy Spirit especially became very, very real to me, and just God in general. And I became very aware that this was a time of awakening for the church, for lay people, for women, as for the first time I became aware of inclusive language, and as an artist became enthusiastic about feminine imagery in the Bible about God. So during college, I first started considering vocations. I did consider the sisterhood, and had lots of nice nuns and stuff, but I'm kind of a free spirit and a little independent, and that just didn't seem the right road for me. And after college, it didn't take long for me to sort of get the impression that marriage wasn't what I was called for either. I had never dated much, and I was trying to decide what to do, and I remember praying to God that, to bring Romeo or whatever, let me fall in love, if this is what I'm meant to do, so I don't make the wrong mistake. And I did date one fellow several times, and God, you have to be careful when you pray for something. I did not fall in love. He fell in love with me, and then I had to turn him down, and, it was a big mess, but it's that loophole the Holy Spirit always finds when you pray for something. But that kind of helped make me decide that that wasn't the road for me either. And it was about that time I was becoming aware that the diaconate was not open to women. I was like, well, what are my choices here? And those of you who know me know that I'm not a real patient person. And I wrote a letter to the diocese. I was feeling a little frustrated. And I wanted to make sure I got an answer. And I asked them, you know, I don't feel called to be married. I don't feel called to the sisterhood. Does the Catholic Church have something else to offer, or do I look elsewhere? I got an answer real fast. They sent me a whole list of secular institutes. And this, I had never heard of them, and never heard of any other similar kinds of vocations. So I sent letters to all of them, and only got one back. And it was this one. And at some point, I met Laura Fitzgerald at a vocation retreat and found out a lot more, and eventually joined up with the Detroit group and met Barbara. And, you know, here I am. But I can sit down then. No. I was very attracted to the feeling of unity and diversity in our group, that there are so many different kinds of people and so open, and different professions and different ways. And it didn't matter if one person, like me, maybe preferred charismatic prayer perhaps to the rosary, and someone else preferred the rosary to that. We're all welcome, and this diversity was fine. And also, as I learned about St. Francis, this is very attractive. I did think he was a bunny petter when I first. Well, you know, he's the god talks to the birds, yeah. But I'd always loved ecology and caring about nature, and when I learned more about Francis, learned about the depths of his concern for animals and nature, and how deeply it went beyond the pretty little stories. Well, eventually I moved to Kansas City. Became what we were calling then isolated, or satellite. I don't know what we are now, but this sort of initiated a lot of change in my life over a long period of time. I think a lot of us are aware of some of the problems we have in the Institute with communication, and now that I was no longer able to meet with my sisters on a monthly basis, this became a lot more obvious and started to become a problem. Because of my interest in inclusive language and in post-Vatican ways of doing things, I was sometimes alienated by the lessons. Didn't always feel I got a lot out of them. And went through some periods of times being disillusioned with my vocation, but also with myself and with my career, and it really started me on a road of self-evaluation. I freelanced for about 10 years, and during that time, I think God took me to some dark times, the dark night of the soul thing, or as my mother would say, a midlife crisis. Okay. But, you know, it really got me to analyzing things and thinking about things, and most important, being open to where God wanted me to go. And learning to stick with God. And the yearly retreats were a huge help. Father Dan, Father Tom, and the different priests that we've had were great at counseling. And finally, you know, I reached a point where I found this ad in the paper that brought me to southern Missouri, where I am now, to the dream job of my life in an industry I didn't even know was there, painting murals and illustrations for natural history museums, living out full-time doing artwork for the ecology. And at the same time, I found out about the Loyola program, which really is a program that helps empower lay people to know the church and know our history and analyze it. We found ourselves and our beliefs in the church. And about that same time, the chapter of Matt started to be mentioned. And it's just very much a time of renewal and renewed hope And in looking back over this, I sort of refound some of the things that at first made the church so glorious to me in college, but with a much more mature eye to it, and a little less of the rosy glow, but a realization that these are very real values and real changes, and that I truly believe that our secular institute can be part of these changes. The Catholic Church as a whole and we as individuals have put our hand to the plow, and we cannot look back. We need to look forward. And I think forward is very much a church of lay people. The Holy Spirit is calling us, especially as women. And as women, we have an opportunity to be an inspiration and a vision to lay women wherever we meet, to help them find where they belong in the church and how they can work and find value for themselves and others in the church and bring us to a whole new age wherever the Holy Spirit may be leading us.
Well, Lucy, we've all had our moments with midlife crises. Some of-
Oh, yes, you have.
Sometimes those midlife crises come a little earlier, and then sometimes they're a little later in life. But eventually, I think we all have some struggles. But thanks for sharing your insights with us. Mary Lou is, excuse me, is our final panelist. Mary Lou, we're glad to have you.
Found it very interesting after being asked to be on the panel to really look back, and my journey ended up going back further than I thought it was going to. So when I was asked to reflect on how the Lord called me to SIM, I went back to the 9th grade. And I did an English research paper on the training of priests, brothers, and nuns. And that wouldn't be such an unusual project for a student to write on, except that I went to the public school. And I'm not sure at that time why I was interested in doing it. About a year and a half later, I began meeting with a parish priest, Father Tevington, an Augustinian, who in retrospect was my first spiritual director before spiritual directors were an in thing. And he was trying to help me discern whether I might have had a vocation in the church. And he was great at always offering to set up a weekend for me to go away to a religious community to see how the sisters lived. And something kept stopping me. And thinking back on it, I think it was fear. And it wasn't fear of going away, but fear that if they let me in, maybe they wouldn't let me out again. In my senior year of high school, our CCD class went on a field trip to the Poor Clare Monastery in Andover, Massachusetts. And I found this very interesting. We talked to the sister as she spoke through the grill, and was fascinated by the life she was leading and the other sisters in that monastery, but knew for sure at that point that as nice as it was for her, I was never going to live there either. So looking back on it, that's where my journey began, that I sensed a call to a vocation, although it was in the very early stages. It was a call not to a community, not to a cloister, but to be lived in the world. Over the next 20 years, I toyed with the idea again, but always kept finding myself either busy with work. I went into the military. That took precedence over things. And finally got out and in my late 30s made a Cursillo weekend. And that was a life-changing weekend for me. It was a time of conversion. And after that weekend, I found my prayer life increased. And I realized there was a lot missing in my life. I sought out a spiritual director. And I lived in Rye, New Hampshire, and fortunately about 2 miles from a retreat center. I didn't know the friars very well. They helped out in our parish because we had just one priest in a fairly active community. Although the friars were considered a little unorthodox. And the first friar that I met with was really the only one that I knew at the time. And at one point I asked him, mentioned to him that I was interested in a more dedicated life. And his response to me is, you don't need to be a nun to live a good life. Well, I wasn't happy with his answer, and sought out a second friar and wrote him a note and asked him for information about the secular Franciscans, as there was a fraternity that met there. And the second friar saw me after Mass one day and said, "You're not interested in the secular Franciscans." And I thought, neither of these guys really know me that well, but they both say they know what I don't want. But the second one said, "I think I do know what you want." And it's funny, we've talked about it since, and he said at the time, he didn't know whether I was married, single, divorced, widowed, had 100 kids. He knew I was active in the parish, and something told him to tell me. That friar was Father Tom. He started telling me after Mass that day about secular institutes. And I thought, knowing that they were considered a little unorthodox, I thought, for over 20 years I've looked at vocations, and if this was something legitimate in the church, I would have heard about it. So I felt this was something the Franciscans had kind of cooked up. But he offered to send a brochure, and he said, "When you get the brochure, if you think you're interested, let me know, and I'll put you in touch with someone." Well, he was also known for not being too prompt with doing anything. So I said, he has till Wednesday to send the brochure. If I don't get it by Wednesday, I'll call him. Well, Wednesday the brochure arrived, and when I first read it, I thought, this is too good to be true. And this looks like everything I was looking for. So I called him up and asked him to put me in touch with someone. I wanted to know more. And he gave me Jean Charest's name and address and phone number. And I thought, well, I'll write her a letter. No, I'll give her a call. And so I tried to call, and her line was busy. And I called a few minutes later, and her line was busy. Well, this went on for over an hour. And finally got through, and I thought, this woman really likes to talk on the phone. And when she answered, I said, "You don't know me?" And she said, "I think I do." And I said, "No, you don't. I don't know anyone in Berlin." And for those of you that don't really know New England too well, New Hampshire is a little tiny state, but it's kind of long. And Jean and I are at very opposite ends of the state, so there's a 3-hour drive between us. And I said, "I know no one in Berlin." She said, "Well, I know you." And this went back and forth, back and forth. Finally, she asked if I knew Father Tom Hadl. And I said, "Is that why your phone's been busy for so long?" So we talked that night, made arrangements to get together over food, and it's obvious that part of us hasn't changed. So we went out to dinner, Chinese. A lot of cats in the backyard of that place. So, and we talked about the Institute, and the more I heard about it, the more I was sure this is what I wanted. And Jean then called Charlene and told her she thought she had a live one. Yeah. And a few weeks later, I met Charlene on their day of recollection and began the application process. And then a couple months later, met Sue Ann. And the rest is history. I'm here. On my way to our first retreat, I was flying to the villa with Charlene. And to get to Logan Airport, I had to take a bus. And on the way to the airport, you go by, it's a big docking area for oil tankers. And I was looking at the different ships anchored there, and there was a ship called the Faith. And I thought, well, geez, that's kind of appropriate for what I'm doing. But I just kind of forgot about it until we were on the plane, and the flight attendant came to serve our beverages, and her name was Hope. I thought, this is kind of unbelievable, but I think then I shared it with Charlene what was going on. It became an area of reflection for me when I was on retreat, and I shared with someone at the end of the retreat that I had come by faith, was served by hope, and was received with much love. And that's my vision for the Institute, too, that especially this week, that we've come with faith in God, faith in ourselves, and faith in this vocation, which is so beautiful. We have hope for the future, hope that we'll be open to the Spirit, and that the Spirit will enkindle in us a new spark. And as we come to really get to know each other, rekindle old friendships, make new, that will grow into a community, or I should change it now to a fraternity of love. And there's a saying that two of the greatest gifts a parent can give a child are roots and wings. I'm not the youngest in the Institute, but as far as years in, I'm one of the younger ones, so I still feel like a child. You have all given me roots, and these roots have provided strength, nourishment, stability, and growth. And just like a tree, we can't cut ourselves off from our roots, that like a tree or a plant, without the roots we'll die. But I also ask for wings. Wings so that we can make this vocation known and understood and attractive to today's women. And together, all of us together, can bring it alive and thriving into the coming millennium. Thanks.
I think I speak for everyone here when I say that all of you have given us a lot to think about and to ponder over the next few days, and that we really appreciate your sharing, because it helps us bolster our own vocations and makes us reflect on what brought us to SIM. So thank you very much.
I am extremely impressed. I couldn't think of 5 greater presenters that I would have liked to have heard the journey of life from than the 5 of you. I really am absolutely impressed. And I told you, is that God surprises us if we allow God to do just that within our midst. And then this is something that is a memory that will be with you if you let it in. And when you let it in, you let it kindle that fire and let it continue to burn, and then share it. Add your own story into the stories that you've heard. And in fact, instead of doing that, like we said, in small group discussions, do that around the dinner table this evening, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to give you a little bit of a break now, because the next thing on our schedule is 5 o'clock. We're going to have our Eucharistic celebration. So you got a chance for potty, for bed, for sun if you want a little bit of that, whatever you need some time to do, okay? Laura is going to collect those cards as you're going out. Tonight at dinner, when you're going in, we're going to hand you each evening at dinner a card. We'll decide each day if we're going to work with numbers or with the saints' names and the like. And we're going to ask you to sit at those tables when you go to dinner for each theme, okay? And to be talking to some new people. And tonight, hopefully, a lot of your conversation is going to be about how wonderful a thing it is to belong and to be called by God to be a member of this special vocation called Secular Institute of Missionaries.